Do all AI brains really think alike? It's a great question, you know? When we build an artificial intelligence, how much do those tiny little details, the real nuts and bolts of its design, actually change the way it, well, thinks?
All right, so let's frame this up. This is the central mystery we're diving into. Picture this. You've got two AIs. You give them the exact same problem to solve, and boom, they both ace it, perfect scores. From the outside, you'd say they're identical, right? But here's the kicker. Does that mean they actually learned to solve it the same way? Or could they be running completely different software, different mental strategies to get to that very same correct answer?
So, to get to the bottom of this, scientists turn to a special kind of AI. It's called a recurrent neural network, or RNN for short. Now, the easiest way to think about these is they're simplified models of our own brain circuits. They've got these little artificial neurons that are all interconnected, and they're just fantastic tools for trying to figure out how biological brains, like ours, might actually work.
Okay, so for the longest time in neuroscience and AI research, there's been this really big assumption. The general thinking went something like this. As long as an AI model learns to do its job, the tiny little details of how it's built, the specific math formula that its artificial neurons use, that stuff doesn't really matter. It's all interchangeable, right? Just minor technical stuff that shouldn't change the big picture solution.
And I'm not exaggerating here. This isn't some vague idea. It's a really foundational belief in the field. In fact, the paper we're looking at puts it super bluntly, saying it's commonly assumed that a specific choice of activation function is inconsequential. In other words, nobody thought it mattered. But what if that whole assumption is just wrong?
All right, so how do you even test an assumption like that? Well, the researchers decided it was time to pop the hood on these AI minds and see what was really going on inside. This is where we find our first big clue.
And the experiment they set up was just beautifully simple. What they did was they took 3 different types of these RNNs. The only difference between them was this one tiny detail, called an activation function. That's basically just a little piece of math that tells an artificial neuron whether to fire or not. You've got ReLU, sigmoid, and TAN, okay? So they trained all 3 on the very same decision-making task. And, just like everyone expected, all 3 learned to do it perfectly, no problem. But then came the fun part. They decided to visualize what was happening inside. What did the AI's thought process actually look like?
And get this. This is what they saw. The difference is just staggering. I mean, look at this. On one side, you've got the internal activity from the ReLU network. As it's solving the problem, it creates this beautiful, complex, almost butterfly-shaped pattern. But then you look at the Tanch network on the other side, solving the exact same problem, remember? And its internal activity looks completely different. It's this straight, sheet-like structure. This is it. This is the smoking gun. Identical performance on the outside, but wildly different processes on the inside.
So that's the big reveal, right? On the outside, they look exactly the same. But on the inside, they are worlds apart. It's like finding out 2 people got the same answer on a math test, but one used calculus and the other used geometry. Just 2 totally different ways of thinking. This wild visual difference obviously begs the question, what are these AIs actually doing inside their digital heads? Let's break down the 2 fundamentally different strategies that the researchers uncovered. So it turns out there were 2 totally distinct approaches. The first group, the ReLU and sigmoid AIs, they used what we'll call the inhibition method. Pretty straightforward. They just learned to actively suppress and ignore any information that was irrelevant. Just block it out. But the TAN AIs, they did something kind of weird and counterintuitive. They used the saturation method. Instead of ignoring the distracting stuff, they basically cranked its volume up to 11, pushing it to such an extreme that it just couldn't have an effect anymore.
This is a great way to picture that inhibition strategy. You can see how some parts of the network basically learn to yell stop at the other parts that are dealing with distractions. It's literally like the AI learns to put on a set of horse blinders, just to block out everything in its peripheral vision and focus only on the road ahead.
And now for that weird saturation strategy. Instead of telling the distractions to shut up, the TARNet network does the opposite. It overloads the circuits that are processing that irrelevant info. It pushes them so hard that they hit their absolute maximum firing rate, a state called saturation. And once they're maxed out, they can't be pushed any further. It's a really clever analogy. It's like turning up some background noise so loud that it stops being music and just becomes a meaningless, constant hum that your brain learns to ignore. Okay, so we've got two very different ways of solving the same problem. Inhibition versus saturation. But you might be thinking, so what? Does this internal difference actually matter in the real world? Well, to find out, the researchers decided to put these AIs through a stress test. They wanted to see which strategy would hold up and which one would break when things got really weird.
And the question was pretty simple, but devious. What happens if we throw a curveball? What if we feed the AIs an irrelevant signal, a distraction that's way stronger than anything they've ever seen before? This is what's called an out-of-distribution input, and it's a great way to see how an AI really handles the unexpected. So how would each strategy cope?
And the results? Oh, they were absolutely striking. Just look at the ReLU network. Its decision boundary, that's the internal line it draws to make a choice, it starts to rotate. It's getting confused. That super strong distraction is breaking through its defenses and messing with its judgment. Those blinders just weren't strong enough. But then, look at the TANGE network. Its decision boundary is rock solid, perfectly stable. The saturation strategy is so ridiculously effective that even this crazy off-the-charts distraction has literally no effect on it. None.
This chart here just lays it all out, crystal clear. You put them under stress, and the performance of the AIs using that blinder strategy, it just tanks. The whole thing is brittle. It shatters under pressure. Meanwhile, the saturation strategy, incredibly robust. Its performance stays right up there. It just doesn't care how strong the distraction gets.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? Why does it matter? Well, let's zoom out a bit and think about what this means, not just for building better AI, but for maybe understanding ourselves.
There's a key concept in AI that explains what's going on here. It's called inductive bias. It's a fancy term, but the idea is simple. It's basically the set of hidden assumptions, or rules of thumb, that are baked into an AI's design from the very beginning. And these biases kind of nudge the AI toward finding certain types of solutions instead of others.
And what this incredible research shows is that a choice that seems so tiny and technical, which activation function to use, is actually a powerful inductive bias. It doesn't just nudge the solution a little bit, it fundamentally shapes the AI's entire worldview, forcing it down one problem-solving path instead of another.
Okay, so let's wrap up the key takeaways here. First, those tiny, seemingly insignificant design choices, they have major consequences. Second, they don't just change things on the surface, they create fundamentally different circuits on the inside. Third, and this is crucial, those different circuits lead to totally different behaviors, especially when things get tough. And all of this forces us to ask a really critical question, especially when we're using these models to try and understand the human brain.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Here's the final twist. The paper points out something we all know about ourselves. Humans get distracted. A lot. I mean, think about the Stroop effect, where you have the word blue written in red ink and you're supposed to say the color of the ink. It's surprisingly hard. Our brains get tripped up by strong, irrelevant information all the time.
And that brings us to the final provocative question. Think about it. The TAN network came up with this perfect, superhumanly robust way to ignore distractions. But the ReLU network, the weaker one that got confused and distracted when things got stressful, doesn't that sound a little more, well, human? So which AI is actually the better model of our minds? The one that's flawless or the one that's flawed in a very familiar way?